And that's the reason why I've said, a couple of months ago, really, give me a test me. And what I found, just a tip for the employers, really. You've got to imagine, the black hat hackers, really, who are, causing all the nuisance, really. Rightly so. They're not going to need a certification to hack into machines, are they? Right? And I just feel like, and speaking to other people in the area of cybersecurity as well, it's such a delayed process. It's like, we need this qualification, we need this one, we need Windows 365, and you join Microsoft and do all of their exams and stuff like that. Yeah, that's great. That's great. But all the black hat, hackers are just getting into all the systems anyway, because they don't see the relevance for certificates, right? And in a way, being a white hat, person myself, really, I see that we kind of, I can imagine, a lot of the community are just laughing at these certificates because, what do they bring you? You basically have to be able to just explain what you're doing, and you have to show your competency, right? So there we go. Lots of people talking about certifications, and I don't know. I just get the feeling that a lot of the employers put up the positions with like 3 years of experience and stuff. It's completely not realistic. It's completely not realistic. And we have up until this week, actually, there's 3.4 million jobs in cybersecurity that aren't being met at the moment. So there's 3.4 million positions worldwide for cybersecurity that are unfilled. So take that as you will, really. So I'm making adjustments this week to my CV a little bit. During the chat that I had with this recruiter, he said, you've really got to explain on your CV a little bit more about what you're doing. I was thinking, well, myself and a lot of other people I know, we've really crafted it well on the CV, just to actually explain that. And I said, did you listen to my podcast? And he said, yes. And I said, well, the podcast is evidence of my own ongoing knowledge there. And it's funny that the employers don't want to risk employing someone that may not be able to, to do the job and communicate what's going on. But isn't the real risk the fact that, the black hat hackers are just getting in and causing mayhem on all the systems, and it's going to cost them more money that way? I don't know, but it just seems there isn't a clear-cut route to cybersecurity, and that's what we've all been saying on LinkedIn until I've just stop the LinkedIn, because no one's joining me. It isn't kind of like throwing the toys out of the bath with the bath water kind of thing. It's the fact that there's no engagement. And you know what? I'll just be doing my podcast, and you'll see me on GitHub as well soon, because that's going to be more fruitious, really. So let's get on to the third part of the podcast, really, and this is really, what does a PhD have in common with becoming a SOC Tier 1 analyst? Now, I listen a lot to Jordan Peterson on his podcasts and all of his speeches and everything else, and I was fascinated actually to find out that for those in university and they're doing their PhD, they really need to write 3 different types of documentation to submit for a PhD. And I don't want to spoil it too much. I'm going to read out the script that I've written to give it a good story through here, really. But it's absolutely fascinating, and maybe you just want to adjust the way that you're running your lab at home for cybersecurity, because you have to get to the point really where you have to start with your own documentation. And let's go into that, shall we? So we're going to explore the idea that really made me stop and think, of course. At first, it might sound like an unusual comparison, but the more I considered it, the more parallels I found. So what does earning a PhD have in common with becoming a SOC Tier 1 cybersecurity analyst? Now, I'm not suggesting, of course, to anyone out there really, that they're the same qualification or that they require the same depth of expertise. Because a PhD is an advanced research degree that demonstrates the ability to create original knowledge within a field, isn't it? And a SOC Tier 1 analyst, by contrast, is applying established knowledge to detect, investigate, and respond to security events. And of course, these are completely different goals. But what fascinates me is that the habits and methods behind both journeys have a great deal in common. So both are built around curiosity, both are built around evidence, and both reward careful documentation. And both depend on being able to explain not just what you found, but how you reach your conclusions. So when people think about a PhD, they often imagine years spent in a laboratory or behind a computer writing thousands of pages of notes. That's kind of partly true, but what a PhD really demonstrates is something deeper. It demonstrates that someone can identify an important question, investigate it systematically, collect evidence, analyse that evidence critically, and communicate their findings clearly enough for other experts to understand and evaluate, right? So that's the essence of all the research they do. Now let's look at that from a kind of cybersecurity point of view. Suppose we've got a phishing alert that arrives in a security operations centre. The analyst doesn't immediately declare what happened. Instead, they start asking questions. Who received the email? Where did it originate? Were there any malicious attachments? Did the user actually click the bloody link? Did PowerShell execute afterwards? And were new processes created? Did anything unusual happen on the network? All of those things we've kind of got to ask ourselves, really. So every answer generates another question, if you see what I mean. And that isn't that much different from the research. It's really the same thing. It's really an investigation. So one thing that changed my own thinking was considering how many substantial pieces of work are needed to demonstrate competence. And I'm just digressing a little bit because I'm starting with I'm going to be doing 10 pieces of work, basically 10 to 15. But many PhD programs assess candidates through a relatively small number of significant research outputs rather than hundreds of tiny projects. The important point isn't the exact number of publications, that varies by discipline and institution, but that each represents sustained rigorous work. And for all of us out there, and me included, all of this lab work is really fucking rigorous work. This isn't child's play. This isn't any fucking about. It's getting down to the real deal. And I think that's what a lot of people miss, to be honest. So it made me wonder whether we should think about cybersecurity portfolios in a similar way. So instead of trying to complete 50 quick labs, what if someone concentrated on producing 3 outstanding investigations, if you know what I mean? So imagine creating a phishing investigation, not simply clicking through a walkthrough. Instead, building a virtual lab, generating the attack, collecting email headers, examining indicators of compromise, reviewing Windows event logs, which I talked about earlier, writing scene queries, creating an investigation timeline, producing recommendations, but really finally kind of like just writing an incident report exactly as you would for a professional SOC, So now imagine repeating that process for malware, then for lateral movement. Each investigation becomes a complete story. Not simply a list of commands, not simply screenshots, a story supported by evidence. That idea really resonates with me because employers just don't want someone who knows commands. And yeah, of course, the muscle memory and stuff is all fine, and just attention to detail. really, when you're writing audit poll and all that stuff. And okay, if you write /var and you write /OSEC, and you're not going to have the capital letters there on that command line, but you are on a lot of others, and you've got to make sure that you have the capital letters there, and otherwise stuff isn't going to work, is it? Um, but yeah, you know, what employers really want is someone who understands why they're running those commands. And I think because of the fact that a lot of us now, I know a lot of wonderful people on LinkedIn, and probably they're not, probably they're not engaging with me anyway, because we're all so busy doing our lab stuff and doing some great work, right? Um, but it's the employers that don't understand the fact that we can get really in depth on our labs and we can be really, really sufficient, but they just need to test us during the interview instead of literally being down our throats about actually getting certificates. That would be the takeaway. If there's nothing else you take away from this podcast episode, is the fact that look at the pure, heavy work that we're doing on, Ethernet based, non-air gap systems. This is like fucking awesome stuff, but it's heavy. It's a cognitive load that some people wouldn't even be able to handle, but we do. So test us. On the stuff. If we've got muscle memory in our fingers, we've got the mental memory upstairs. And that's really it for from an employer's kind of point of view. Really, they want to know what question are we trying to answer. What evidence is going to support our conclusion? Could someone else reproduce the investigation? And these are the research skills. And me with a journalism background, and a lot of us, we are so heavily into pattern recognition, it's uncanny. You don't. I'm up to 8 months now on cybersecurity. You wouldn't get that far if you could not do pattern recognition. You'd fall off the wagon after a couple of weeks. Really. Documentation, let's go into that really. So that's another area where the comparison becomes surprisingly strong. Researchers keep detailed notes because experiments need to be repeatable. If another researcher follows the same methodology, they should arrive at similar conclusions. So cybersecurity works in much the same way. If another analyst picks up your incident report during the next shift, they should understand exactly what happened, what evidence was collected, and what remains unknown, and what actions have already been taken. It's a little bit like when you listen to late night Linux, right? When you've got, someone writing code, and they throw it over the wall, basically, for the person to run the code, right? The person running the code is, you've got to have both people you've got to have both people fully understanding what's going on, really. So we have to remember that, good documentation saves time. It reduces mistakes. It improves teamwork, and it creates trust. And one phrase you'll often hear in science is, show you're working. I'd argue that the same principle applies in cybersecurity. We don't simply say that the host was compromised. We actually explain why. We show the logs, we show the timestamps, which I just explained to you on the event viewer as well. You've got the 4688, and then, the second column to the left is the timestamp. We show the network traffic, we show the process tree, we show the evidence. And that's what makes an investigation credible. Because another interesting comparison is how knowledge gets shared. So today, many cybersecurity professionals publish projects on GitHub. Employees can browse repositories, read documentation, review scripts, and understand how someone approached technical problems. It's almost like an online research portfolio, and that's really where I'm going to be, just concentrating my efforts on next, really. But before GitHub became the dominant platform, developers shared their work through systems such as CVS, Subversion, Mercurial, mailing list self-hosted repositories and project hosting services like SourceForge, SourceForge, and it's always lovely to know a little bit of history about what came before, because GitHub just wasn't boom there. It wasn't like the internet was just boom there. It was came out from the military kind of angle, didn't it? On the very start of the internet there, really. But nowadays the technology has changed enormously, but the principle hasn't. People have always needed a way to demonstrate what they can actually do. And this brings me to certifications. So qualifications such as CompTIA Security Plus provide an excellent foundation. I do agree with that. I really do. They show that you studied the fundamentals of networking, operating systems, risk management, identity, cryptography, and security principles. And obviously that's valuable knowledge. But knowledge alone isn't always enough. Imagine interviewing two candidates, if you will. Both have the same certification. One says they completed 20 online labs, and the other presents 3 detailed investigations with timelines, log analyst, screenshots, command line evidence, detection logic, lessons learned, and professional reports. Which candidate is likely to leave the stronger impression? For many employers, the portfolio demonstrates not only technical understanding but also communication, organisation and persistence. And those qualities matter in a SOC. Of course, there's an important distinction to keep in mind. A PhD aims to advance human knowledge by answering questions no one has answered before. An entry-level SOC analyst isn't expected to invent new security theory. Of course they're not. Instead, they're expected to apply existing techniques consistently and accurately to protect real systems. So the comparison isn't about equivalence, it's about mindset. Both reward disciplined thinking. Both reward intellectual honesty. Both reward people who follow the evidence rather than jump into conclusion. And just as a side point really as well, for those of us that do run our own home labs, it's often self-directed learning. And self-directed learning, in a day and age where we've got YouTube shorts of 10 seconds, come on, that's their attention span, then we're doing an absolutely godly, level of amazing stuff with our labs, because we've got attention span probably that's, in line with the best of the best in the world, really. Because we can just plod on for hours and hours on end. And I know that a lot of you out there do that as well as I do. So whether you're writing a research paper or investigating a security alert, the process is remarkably similar. Observe carefully, ask good questions, collect reliable evidence, test your assumptions, document everything, communicate clearly, and then be willing to revise your conclusions if new evidence appears. And that's good science. It's also really good cybersecurity. So if you're starting your journey towards becoming a SOC Tier 1 analyst, perhaps don't worry so much about how many labs you've completed. Instead, ask yourself a different question. Can I demonstrate my thinking? Can I explain my methodology? Can I produce evidence that someone else could review? Can I tell the story of an investigation from beginning to end? Because that's what employers are looking for. They're looking for people who can think methodically under pressure, people who remain curious, people who trust evidence more than assumptions. In many ways, those are exactly the same qualities that make an excellent researcher. So, thank you really so much for listening today. And if this episode has given you a different perspective of learning cybersecurity, I'd love to hear your thoughts, to be honest. Do you keep building up a small portfolio of deep, well-documented investigations? Because it's more valuable than completing dozens of quick labs. It's an interesting conversation, and I expect it's one we continue to have as cybersecurity education evolves. So until next time, everyone, And that was a long episode today, really, wasn't it? Keep learning, keep investigating, and remember, quality of understanding often matters far more than the quantity